"Please, buy me and make me your wife," whispered the Apache Woma, chained like a wild animal. The sun was just rising over the dusty horizon when the town came alive with noise, shouting, and the sound of horse hooves on the dry, hard ground. People were moving about quickly, carrying goods, calling out to each other and trying to start their day. But amidst all this ordinary life, there was something, or rather someone, that drew eyes like a magnet. A woman, chained and silent, was being led through the streets. She did not scream or beg. Burn. She walked with her head down, her dark eyes burning quietly with anger, pain, and something else, something fierce and untamed. She was from the Apache people, a tribe that had long lived freely in the mountains and deserts far from towns like this. And now she had been taken from her home, from her family, from the life she had known, and reduced to a spectacle in chains. The townspeople watched in silence or whispered among themselves. Narration. Some pointed, some laughed. Some looked away, pretending they did not see. The children were the first to ask questions, their innocent voices carrying over the street. Is she? One whispered. Why is she chained like that? Asked another. But the adults either shushed them or turned their backs, unwilling to face the truth of what had been done. It was easier to look the other way, easier to believe she was just a problem, a possession, a curiosity. But she was more than that. She was human. She was proud. And even in chains, there was a fire in her that no one could put out. She remembered the day her life changed forever. She had been with her family in the mountains, gathering food and water when strangers arrived.
They carried weapons and wore faces that showed no mercy. Her family had tried to fight, tried to protect each other, tried to run.
But there were too many of them! She remembered the cries of her mother, the shouts of her brothers, and the chaos of the attack. When she was taken, she had tried to resist. She had kicked, screamed, and fought with all her strength. But one man was stronger, faster, and relentless. Narration.
He had chained her wrists and forced her onto a horse, ignoring her struggles, ignoring her pleas. That had been the beginning of a journey she never wanted, through a world that was cruel, unfair, and dangerous.
Now, as she walked through the town, she noticed everything. The expressions on people's faces, the way the guards handled the chains, the way the wind carried the smell of dust and horses. She observed silently, carefully, like a wild animal studying its surroundings. Her mind was always moving, always thinking, always planning. She was not broken even though her body ached and her spirit was heavy with sorrow. She refused to give the captors the satisfaction of seeing her collapse. Her eyes met those of a few townspeople, and she saw hesitation in some, fear in others, and indifference in many. But she also noticed small acts of kindness. A young girl who dropped a piece of bread near her feet. A man who looked away rather than stare. A child who held a mother's hand tightly, sensing that something was wrong. Those small gestures reminded her that not everyone was cruel, that there was still humanity in the world even if it was hiding behind walls of fear and habit.
Her thoughts often wandered to her family, to the people she loved and had lost.
The way he taught her to hunt, the stories he told about their ancestors, and the pride he had shown in her courage. She remembered her mother's gentle voice, the warmth of her embrace, the songs she sang by the fire at night. She remembered her brothers laughing, teasing each other, and the way they had promised to protect one another no matter what. Those memories were painful now, but they also kept her alive. They reminded her who she was and what she stood for. They reminded her that she was not just a victim, but a person with a history, a family, and a spirit that could not be chained. As the procession continued, the woman began to notice the town itself, the wooden buildings, the dusty streets, the small shops with goods displayed outside. She had never been in a place like this, and though her heart was heavy, her mind could not help but study every detail. Brrr. She noticed how people moved, how they reacted to each other, and how the guards managed the crowd. She realized that if she wanted to survive, she had to understand this world as well as she understood her own breath. She had to be careful. She had to watch.
She had to wait for the right moment. Even in chains, she refused to be silent in her own mind.
She spoke to herself quietly, telling herself stories, planning her next steps, remembering lessons her father had taught her about courage, patience, and observation. She remembered how he said, "A person can be strong even when they appear weak." The body may be restrained, but the mind is always free. She repeated those words in her mind, letting them anchor her. Every step she took, every glance she cast was measured. She knew she had to survive, not just for herself, but for the memory of her family, for the hope of one day being free again. The townspeople, for all their curiosity, did not understand her. They saw a chained woman, not a human being with thoughts, feelings, and memories. They assumed she would be frightened, obedient, or broken. But she remained silent, walking steadily, her eyes sharp, her mind alert. She had learned the hard way that people underestimated those they thought were weak. And she intended to use that underestimation to her advantage. She had to. Survival demanded it. The sun climbed higher, beating down on her back and making the chains heavier and hotter. Her wrists were sore, her arms tired, but she refused to show weakness. He walked with careful determination, as if each step was a silent declaration of strength. She observed the guards, noting the patterns of their movements, the shifts in their attention, and the times when their focus faltered. She noticed the way the wind could carry sounds, the way shadows moved across the ground, and even the gaps in the town's fences. Every detail mattered. Every small observation could become a tool for escape, a means of survival, or a chance at reclaiming her life. Despite the fear and pain, she held on to something deep inside her. Hope. It was fragile, almost invisible, but it existed. Hope that one day she would see her family again. Hope that one day she would walk freely on the land she loved. Hope that one day the world would see her not as a captive, but as a person with a story, a voice, and the right to live with dignity. She clung to that hope like a lifeline, and it gave her strength to endure the chains, the curious stares, and the harsh, unforgiving sun. And in the midst of the crowd, there was a man. He was quiet, observing more than speaking. His face showed signs of hardship. His eyes carried a calm that was rare in this town. He noticed her, not as an object, but as a person. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and in that moment something passed between them. A recognition, a silent understanding. She could not speak to him. Not yet, but she sensed he was different. Perhaps he would notice the courage behind her silence. Perhaps he would see the human being she truly was. As the day continued and the town carried on with its business, the woman kept walking, keeping her head high despite the chains and the burden of her loss. She moved like a shadow through a world that did not understand her, learning, observing, and surviving. She refused to let the cruelty of others define her. She refused to let chains define her spirit. Deep inside, she nurtured a fierce hope, a belief that one day freedom would come, and she would reclaim her life, her name, and her dignity. The woman's days in the town passed slowly, each one blending into the next, yet each filled with quiet observation and careful thought. Barely. She had been placed in a small, grim building near the center of the town, a place where others could come to see her as though she were a curiosity rather than a human being. The chains around her wrists were heavy, but more than the weight of the metal, she carried the weight of memories, fear, and the knowledge that every moment could be dangerous. She learned quickly to move without drawing attention, to speak only when necessary, and to listen, really listen, to everything happening around her. The townspeople were predictable in some ways. They gawked, whispered, and speculated.
They assumed she would be fearful, obedient, or broken.
But she was none of those things. Inside, she was alive with thoughts, strategies, and a quiet fire that refused to be extinguished. Breath. She studied the guards who came to check on her, noticing the slight pauses, the inattentive moments, the moments when one of them would step away for a conversation or for a drink. She memorized their routines, the creak of the floorboards under their boots, the sounds that traveled across the empty hallways. Every detail mattered. Berate. Every moment of carelessness was a potential opportunity, a thread she could pull to change her situation, even if only a little. It was during one of these quiet afternoons that she noticed the man who had first caught her attention on the streets. He did not walk like the other townspeople. He moved carefully, almost as if he was watching more than he was being watched. There was a steadiness in him, a calm in his eyes, that was rare in this chaotic place. Unlike the others, he did not stare at her with curiosity or judgment. Instead, he looked briefly, almost as if he were assessing not her body, but her spirit. That small, fleeting look did not go unnoticed. For the first time since her capture, she felt that perhaps someone could see her as more than just a prisoner. The man came back again and again, each time observing silently from a distance. Sometimes he watched her during the day, leaning against a wooden post in the market square. Desperate times, he appeared near the building where she was kept, but never in a way that would draw suspicion. He was careful, quiet, and deliberate, which made her curious. She began to anticipate his presence, to notice his subtle gestures and movements, to wonder who he was and why he seemed different from everyone else in the town. She felt a strange mixture of caution and hope. One day, when the sun was high and the heat made the metal of her chains almost unbearable, she spoke for the first time, not loudly, but softly, almost a whisper. "Please," she said, her voice low but steady, "buy me and make me your wife." She spoke not out of submission, but out of strategy. Her words were a gamble, a test to see if this man might be different, someone who could understand her situation and perhaps offer her a chance at survival. It was a desperate move, but it was also an act of courage. She had little else to lose, and she refused to let fear completely control her actions. The man froze for a moment when he heard her. No one else had spoken to him directly about her, and certainly no one had asked him anything so boldly. He looked at her carefully, trying to read the meaning behind her words. He realized immediately that she was not speaking from weakness. She was speaking from intelligence, from a place of necessity, and perhaps even from hope. Her voice, soft though it was, carried something powerful, a plea that was not for charity, but for recognition of her humanity. In the following days, the man began to act. Not boldly, not in ways that would attract attention, but in small, deliberate ways. He brought her extra water when the day was hottest. He adjusted her blankets at night to keep her warm.
He ensured that no one was careless with her chains when she had to be moved. Each gesture was small, almost invisible, but they were noticed.
She noticed. Slowly, a quiet trust began to form between them. Not complete, not absolute, but enough to remind her that not everyone in the world was cruel. She started to speak more often, though always carefully. She asked simple questions about the town, about the people, and about the world outside her village. The man answered, also cautiously, respecting her intelligence and her dignity. Through these small conversations, they began to understand each other. He learned of her past, of her family, of the life she had lost. She learned that he had seen hardship too, that he understood the pain of losing something precious. Neither spoke of ownership, power, or control. Instead, they spoke of survival, courage, and the desire to live with dignity. Time passed and the bond between them grew stronger. Though still unspoken in many ways, they communicated through small gestures, careful movements, and the occasional whispered conversation when the town was quiet. She taught him patience, the importance of watching and listening, the value of small details. He taught her trust, demonstrating through consistent actions that she could rely on him, even in a world that often did not value human life. One afternoon, a situation arose that tested both of them. A group of men had grown curious about her and attempted to intimidate her, making cruel jokes and gestures. The guards were slow to intervene. For the first time, she saw fear, not in herself, but in the faces of the men who had underestimated her. The man was there, standing silently, his presence calm and steady. When the men tried to approach her, he stepped forward, not with violence, but with authority. He spoke firmly, demanding they back away. His calm confidence combined with her quiet defiance caused the aggressors to retreat. She realized then that they could be stronger together, not through chains or control, but through mutual respect and courage. That evening, as the sun set and the town quieted, she thought about her life before captivity and the life she might yet have. She realized that her journey was no longer just about survival. It was about understanding trust, hope, and the strength that could be found in unexpected alliances. She understood that the man had not rescued her in the traditional sense, but he had created space for her to see herself differently, as someone capable, intelligent, and resilient. She also began to notice how the townspeople were changing their perception of her, very slowly. Some began to hesitate before speaking cruelly. Others avoided overt mockery. It was as if her quiet dignity combined with the man's subtle support created a new narrative in the town, a reminder that even those who were chained physically could command respect through courage and composure. She understood that respect was not given lightly, but could be earned through persistence, intelligence, and quiet strength. Night after night, she whispered stories to herself, recounting her family, the mountains of her homeland, and the lessons she had learned from her ancestors.
She planned, imagining different ways to regain her freedom, always careful not to let anyone overhear.
She learned patience as never before, realizing that survival sometimes required waiting, observing, and making choices with precision. She also began to recognize the power of connection, small acts of kindness, and the importance of allies in a world that was often harsh and unjust. Slowly, a transformation began to occur inside her. She was no longer simply a captive. She was a strategist, an observer, a survivor. She understood her strength and the value of her intelligence. And while she had been chained physically, her mind and spirit were becoming freer with each passing day. The man's quiet presence reminded her that even in the darkest situations, people could act with integrity, empathy, and courage. He became a symbol of hope, not ownership, not power, but possibility. By the end of Part 2, she no longer felt entirely alone. There was still danger and uncertainty, but there was also a small, growing bond with someone who saw her as human. She began to dream again, not of immediate escape, but of a future where she could make choices, reclaim her life, and perhaps find freedom in more than just body, but in mind and spirit as well. Every day brought challenges, but also lessons, small victories, and a sense that the world, though cruel, still had spaces where compassion could exist, even if hidden, even if fragile. And so she continued to watch, listen, and plan.
She continued to speak cautiously, trusting her instincts and the man who had begun to earn her confidence. Chains might still bind her hands, but her spirit was learning to move freely, preparing for the day when she would have the strength, knowledge, and opportunity to take control of her own destiny once more. The days in the town had become a strange rhythm for the Apache woman. Each day was filled with the ordinary sounds of a small town: horses, carts, the murmur of people moving about. But beneath it all, a tension lingered. Desperation. She knew that every moment could bring danger, yet there was something new in the air. The man who had quietly begun to notice her was no longer just an observer. His presence was deliberate, protective, and steady. He moved through the town with care, watching not only her but the people around her, as if measuring their intentions and gauging the risks they posed. One morning the woman awoke to find a small gift at her feet, a simple cloth to rest her head, a cup of water, and a few pieces of dried fruit. It was not much, but it was more than anyone else had ever given her. Brave, she picked up the cloth and held it against her chest, realizing that small acts of kindness could be as powerful as open rebellion. The man had not spoken, had not announced his intentions. Instead, he acted quietly, with consistency. In his actions, she saw respect and patience. She realized that trust, even in a world so full of cruelty, could be built one small step at a time. That afternoon, a new problem arose. A group of men in the town, curious and cruel, approached her enclosure with loud laughter and jeering words. They tried to provoke her, to see if they could break her spirit or make her obey their demands. The chains around her wrists clinked as she shifted her weight, but she did not respond with fear or anger. Instead, she waited, observing their movements, studying the pattern of their advance. Building in the air, the expectation that she would cower. But she refused to give them that satisfaction. The man appeared almost without warning. He stepped forward calmly, his gaze fixed on the men, his voice firm but quiet. "Step back," he said. "There is no need for cruelty here." His presence had an effect. The men hesitated, their bravado faltering for a moment. They were surprised to find someone willing to challenge them, not with violence, but with authority. The woman watched carefully, noting how his calmness shifted the balance of power. It was a lesson she would remember. Strength did not always have to come from force. Sometimes it came from control, from clarity, and from courage. After the men left, she looked at him with a mixture of gratitude and curiosity. For the first time she spoke without fear, her voice steady. "Why do you care?" she asked. "Why do you help me?" The man paused, choosing his words carefully. "Because it is right," he said simply. "Because no one deserves to be treated as less than human. Because you have a right to live with dignity." His words were plain, but to her they carried weight. In a world filled with injustice, such honesty and integrity were rare. She realized that he was not motivated by pity, curiosity, or desire for recognition. He acted out of principle.
This realization sparked something inside her.
She began to see that freedom was not just about escaping chains, but about having allies, understanding who could be trusted, and learning to navigate a world that could be both cruel and kind. She began to speak more often, asking questions, seeking advice, and testing boundaries. The man responded with patience, offering guidance, not orders. He treated her as an equal in thought and spirit, even while her body remained constrained by chains. It was a delicate balance, and one that required careful attention from both of them. Over the next few days, they began to make small plans together. Nothing was rushed. Nothing was reckless. They discussed quietly how to move safely, how to take advantage of the moments when guards were inattentive, and how to use the town itself to create opportunities. Every detail mattered, from the shift changes of the guards to the patterns of wind that carried sound, from the placement of doors and windows to the habits of the townspeople. She learned to trust her instincts more deeply, and she found that the man's observations often complemented her own, creating a partnership built on intelligence, caution, and mutual respect. Then one evening, a sudden incident changed everything. A small fire broke out in one of the market stalls near her enclosure. Smoke filled the air, and people panicked, running in all directions. Bears. The chaos created a momentary opportunity. The guards were distracted, shouting at townspeople to clear the area. The Apache woman noticed the gaps in their attention. Her heart raced. She could feel both fear and exhilaration. This was the first chance she had to move beyond mere observation and take a real step toward freedom. The man was there, close but unobtrusive. He had noticed the fire before anyone else and had prepared for such an emergency. Without speaking, he guided her with subtle gestures, showing her where to step and when to move.
They communicated silently, their bond allowing them to understand each other without words.
The world outside was in chaos, but inside that moment, there was clarity. She knew that this was her chance. He knew it too. Together, they had to act decisively. As the fire spread, the guards became increasingly panicked. The woman saw their attention falter, their authority slipping bit. With the man's guidance, she moved carefully, avoiding detection, and stepped out of the immediate line of sight. Her heart pounded, and her hands ached from the chains, but her mind remained focused. Every movement had to be precise. Every decision could mean success or disaster. She had survived many dangers before, but this felt different. This was not just survival. This was a choice to take control, even if only for a moment. Once she was in a less crowded area, the man spoke quietly. "Despero, we must move," he said. "Follow me." She nodded, understanding the gravity of his words. He led her through side streets, across alleys, and behind buildings where she could not be seen. The town was still in chaos, but the danger was immediate and real. She relied on him, but she also relied on her own instincts, honed from years of living freely in the mountains. Every step, every breath, every glance mattered. Her head. They were moving together, yet separately, each aware of the other's presence and actions. When they finally reached a place of temporary safety, a small hidden shed at the edge of town, the woman paused to catch her breath. The chains still bound her wrists, but for the first time she felt a sense of possibility. The man removed some of the chains with a tool he had brought, careful not to make noise. She flexed her wrists and felt the relief of movement. She could still escape further if needed, but for now, she stayed, trusting the man who had risked so much for her. They sat in silence for a few moments, listening to the distant chaos of the town. The fire continued to burn, but it was far enough away that it did not threaten them directly. In that quiet space, the woman felt a mixture of emotions: fear, relief, gratitude, and a cautious hope. She realized that she was no longer entirely powerless. She had a partner who understood her, respected her, and believed in her ability to survive. That realization sparked a determination she had not felt in days. She would not simply be a captive anymore. She would plan, act, and reclaim her life, one step at a time. Breathe. The man spoke then, his voice calm but firm. "You are brave," he said. "Brave enough to survive, to think, and to act, and brave enough to trust, even when it is difficult." His words were simple, but they carried meaning. She understood that bravery was not just about fighting or resisting. It was about observing, planning, and making choices, even under pressure. She felt a deep sense of respect for him, just as he respected her. It was a partnership built not on ownership or power, but on trust, courage, and shared purpose. By the end of that night, the woman understood something crucial. Her chains were not just metal. They were a symbol of the world's attempt to control her. But chains could be broken, circumvented, and avoided. The mind, the heart, and the determination of a person could never be truly restrained. With the man's guidance, she realized that freedom was not just a distant dream. It was something she could begin to grasp with careful planning, courage, and persistence. As the fire died down and the town settled into uneasy calm, the woman looked at him with a quiet intensity. She understood that the next steps would be more dangerous, more deliberate, and more decisive. But she also understood that she was no longer alone. Together they had taken a bold step that changed everything. The balance of power had shifted, even if just slightly. She could feel it in the air, in the subtle changes in the town, and in the confidence that was slowly building inside her. In that moment, she made a silent vow to herself, to her family she had lost, and to the hope of a life she still longed for. She would not be defined by chains. She would not be defined by the cruelty of others. She would reclaim her life step by step with courage, intelligence, and the support of someone who truly saw her. And for the first time in many days, she allowed herself to believe that the impossible might one day become possible. The days after the fire were tense and quiet, almost like the calm that follows a storm. The town was shaken. The guards were more alert, and whispers of what had happened began to spread. For the Apache woman, the chaos had brought a small measure of freedom, but it also brought a new kind of danger. She could no longer stay completely hidden, and the town's curiosity and suspicion were growing. Every sound, every movement outside her small refuge demanded attention. She had to watch carefully, because even a small mistake could undo everything they had risked to gain a moment of safety. Inside, she struggled with her own thoughts and fears. Even though the man had helped her escape immediate danger, she still had chains in her past, memories of loss, pain, and betrayal that weighed heavily on her. Sometimes she could feel her heart tighten with fear, remembering the violence that had stolen her family and her home. Other times she felt a surge of anger at the injustice of being treated as less than human. These emotions were constant companions, both painful and necessary. They reminded her of who she was, what she had survived, and why she needed to remain strong. The man understood these moments better than anyone else could. He did not rush her, and he did not demand words. She was not ready to speak. Brave. Instead, he offered patience and presence. Sometimes he would simply sit nearby, silent, letting her process her emotions in her own way. Other times he would quietly help her plan small steps towards safety, always making sure she had agency in every decision. Slowly, the woman began to realize that trust was not something demanded. It was something earned, and it could grow through consistent actions and understanding. They began to explore the town cautiously, moving in ways that would avoid drawing attention. Each outing was small, a trip to the edge of the market, a walk through a quiet alley, or a visit to a place where they could observe the town without being seen. She noticed how the townspeople reacted differently when she moved with the man. Some still stared, some whispered, but there were fewer overt threats. The combination of her dignity and his calm authority had begun to shift the balance, even if just slightly. She understood that they were creating a new narrative, one in which she was no longer entirely defined by the chains she had worn. Even as she moved, her mind worked constantly. She considered every risk, every potential escape, and every way to reclaim control over her life. She learned to anticipate the guards' movements, to notice when someone was watching too closely, and to identify safe spots where she could rest or hide if necessary. Desperation. Each day brought new lessons, and she absorbed them with the keen intelligence that had kept her alive through so many hardships. She began to understand that survival required more than strength. It required strategy, patience, and courage. At night, she spoke more openly with the man. They shared stories of the lives they had lost, the people they had loved, and the lessons they had learned. She told them about the mountains and rivers of her homeland, the animals she had hunted, and the traditions her family had cherished. In return, he spoke of his own hardships, the loneliness he had endured, and the principles that guided his life. These conversations were never rushed or forced. They were moments of connection, moments that allowed her to reclaim a sense of identity and humanity she had feared lost forever. But even as trust grew, danger was never far away. The town had noticed her absence from public display, and rumors began to circulate. Some accused the man of helping her escape. Others whispered that she might be planning something. The woman knew that their time of relative safety was limited. Every decision they made had consequences, and every misstep could put them both at risk. She learned to balance courage with caution, to plan carefully without letting fear paralyze her, and to act decisively when opportunity presented itself. The man became her guide, but also her partner in thinking. He did not lead without consulting her. Instead, he offered options and helped her weigh the risks. Slowly, she began to rely on him not just for protection, but for insight and perspective. She realized that she did not have to face the world alone, that collaboration did not diminish her strength, and that trust could be a tool for survival rather than a weakness. Their bond deepened, built not on possession, but on mutual respect, understanding, and shared determination. One afternoon, a challenge tested that bond. A town guard, suspicious and overbearing, approached their hiding place, demanding to know why she was absent. Her heart pounded, but she remained calm, signaling subtly to the man that she would need his support. Together, they devised a way to divert his attention. The man engaged him in conversation, asking questions and drawing him away, while she quietly moved to a safer position, observing and ready to act if needed. A plan worked flawlessly, and she felt a surge of confidence. She understood that danger could be managed, and that careful strategy could protect her even in moments of high risk. As evening fell, the woman reflected on the journey she had traveled so far. She had endured captivity, survived violence, and learned to navigate a world that was often cruel and unpredictable. She had discovered that courage was not just a physical act, but a mental one. It was the ability to observe, to plan, and to act with intention, even when fear was present. It was the strength to trust someone else, carefully and cautiously, while still maintaining independence and control over her own life. He saw the resilience, intelligence, and strength that others in the town failed to recognize. He understood that his role was not to rescue her completely, but to create conditions where she could reclaim her own power. In doing so, he found purpose, responsibility, and a sense of connection he had not known before. Their relationship was not about ownership or control. It was about partnership, mutual respect, and shared courage. Over the next several days, they began to plan for a longer-term path to safety. They considered the town's layout, the habits of the guards, and the potential routes they could take if they needed to leave quickly. They discussed what they would do once they were out of immediate danger, thinking about food, shelter, and the possibility of finding a place where she could be free again. These conversations required patience, careful thought, and honesty. They debated options, assessed risks, and made decisions together, strengthening both their trust and their resolve. Despite the constant presence of danger, the woman began to feel a sense of hope she had not felt in years. She realized that even in the midst of captivity, cruelty, and uncertainty, it was possible to find allies, build trust, and take steps toward reclaiming freedom. Breath. She understood that survival required more than endurance. It required courage, intelligence, and the willingness to act decisively when opportunity arose, and she recognized that she did not have to face these challenges alone. One night, as they sat quietly in their hidden refuge, the man spoke softly. "You have endured so much," he said, "and yet you continue to fight, to think, and to plan. That strength is extraordinary." She looked at him, feeling a mix of gratitude and quiet determination. She realized that her strength had always been within her, but that it could be supported and amplified through trust, partnership, and careful action. She felt a renewed sense of purpose, a determination to reclaim her life, and a growing belief that freedom was not just a dream, but a goal she could reach with patience and courage. By the end of Part 4, the Apache woman had begun to transform from a captive into a strategist and planner, aware of both the dangers and possibilities around her. She had learned to trust, not blindly, but wisely. She had discovered that courage was not only about physical strength, but also about mental resilience, observation, and patience. And she had begun to see that with careful planning, intelligence, and partnership, she could create a path toward freedom. A path that honored her dignity, her past, and her hopes for the future. She understood that the journey ahead would not be easy. There would be challenges, setbacks, and dangers she could not yet foresee, but she also understood that she was no longer entirely alone, and that trust, courage, and careful action could create opportunities even in the most unlikely places. And in that quiet understanding, she found a strength that no chains, no guards, and no cruelty could ever take from her. The days grew longer, and the town slowly returned to its usual rhythm, after the chaos of the fire and the whispers of rebellion. But for the Apache woman, life had changed forever. She was no longer just a captive chained for others' amusement. Her mind was alert, her spirit stronger, and her heart filled with cautious hope. She had learned how to survive, how to observe, how to act with intelligence, and how to trust the man who had shown her respect and kindness. Together they had quietly planned a path toward freedom, step by step preparing for the day when she could leave the town behind and reclaim her life. That day finally came with the first light of dawn. The town was still quiet, the streets nearly empty, and the guards focused on their routine rather than on what was happening elsewhere. The woman felt the chains that still remained on her wrists loosen under the man's careful hands. They had saved the keys, hidden them, and planned every movement with precision. She flexed her wrists and felt the familiar sting of confinement, but it was tempered with the thrill of possibility. For the first time in many months, she felt the freedom to move as she wished, even if only within the hidden spaces around her. Together they slipped through the alleys, avoiding the main streets where people might recognize them. Every step was deliberate. Every sound mattered. She moved with a mix of caution and excitement, her mind fully aware of the risks, but also aware of the possibilities. She had imagined this moment countless times in the quiet nights before, envisioning herself running, breathing freely, and finally choosing her own path. Now, it was real. The fear of the unknown was balanced by the hope that she had nurtured for so long. As they approached the outskirts of the town, the woman glanced back one last time. The buildings rose like shadows against the morning sky, and the streets were beginning to stir with life. She felt a mix of relief and sorrow, relief for what she was leaving behind, and sorrow for the world that had treated her so cruelly. But she also understood that this moment was not just about escape. It was about reclaiming identity, dignity, and a future that belonged to her. She held her head high, feeling the wind on her face and the warmth of the morning sun, sensing the vastness of the world waiting beyond the town's limits. The man walked beside her, silent but present, guiding her through safe paths and ensuring that no one could follow too closely. He had proven over time that he could be trusted, that his intentions were true, and that he saw her as more than a captive or a possession. She realized that trust, carefully earned, was one of the most powerful tools she had discovered. It allowed her to plan, to act boldly, and to believe that freedom was not just a dream but a reachable goal. Once they were far enough from the town to feel relatively safe, they paused in a quiet clearing surrounded by trees and open land. The woman knelt and touched the earth, feeling the connection to the land she had loved in her childhood. She remembered her family, her village, and the mountains where she had grown up. The memories were bittersweet, painful reminders of what she had lost, but also guiding lights for what she hoped to reclaim. She allowed herself to breathe deeply, feeling a sense of strength and determination, unlike anything she had experienced since being captured. The man watched her quietly, understanding the depth of her emotions without needing words. Finally, she spoke, her voice low but steady. "I am free," she said, "but I want more than freedom. I want my life." "I want to live with dignity, and I want to be remembered as someone who survived, not someone who was defeated." Her words carried weight, reflecting the journey she had traveled and the growth she had achieved through courage, observation, and careful planning. Together, they began to move across the open land, traveling through forests, along streams, and over hills. The world felt vast and alive, filled with possibilities.
They spoke of the future, not in terms of immediate escape, but in terms of building a life where she could choose her path, find safety, and even hope for happiness again. The man offered guidance, advice, and protection, but never control.
She made decisions, chose directions, and suggested paths. This equality was new and empowering, giving her confidence that she could reclaim her independence while still benefiting from partnership and trust. Days passed, and the woman learned to navigate the land once again, just as she had before her capture. She hunted small animals, gathered edible plants, and drank from streams. Each act was a reminder of her skill, her intelligence, and her resilience. The chains that had once bound her wrists were gone, but she understood that freedom was more than physical. It was mental, emotional, and spiritual. She had learned to trust herself, to trust others carefully, and to make choices that honored her past while creating a future. The man and she also faced dangers along the way: wild animals, harsh weather, and the possibility of people tracking them from the town. Yet each obstacle was met with careful planning, observation, and cooperation. They relied on each other's strengths, combining his knowledge of the world outside the town with her understanding of survival and strategy.
Together, they were stronger than they had been separately. They moved quietly, efficiently, and purposefully, ensuring that the woman's journey toward freedom remained uninterrupted.
Eventually, they reached a place far from the town where the trees opened into a wide plain and the mountains rose in the distance. It reminded the woman of home, the wild land where she had grown up, where her family had lived freely and where the wind carried the sounds of life in all directions. She knelt again and ran her hands through the grass, feeling the earth beneath her fingers. Tears came unbidden, not of sorrow, but of relief, gratitude, and quiet joy. She was free, yes, but she had also survived, learned, and grown in ways that made her stronger than she had ever imagined. In that moment, she spoke to the man, her voice calm and clear. "Thank you," she said. "Bert, not just for helping me escape, but for seeing me, for respecting me, and for showing me that even in the darkest times, people can act with kindness and courage." The man nodded, his face calm but proud.
"You earned this," he replied. "You planned, observed, and acted with courage."
I only helped you see what you already knew was possible. The woman smiled, feeling the truth of his words.
She realized that freedom was not a gift. It was something she had fought for with every thought, every observation, every careful step. And now she could truly claim it. Brr. She could live on her own terms, honor the memory of her family, and continue her life with dignity and purpose. As the sun rose higher over the plains, the woman made a vow to herself. Inspiration. She would never forget the lessons she had learned. The value of patience, the strength of intelligence, the importance of trust, and the courage it took to survive against overwhelming odds. Inspiration. She would carry these lessons with her, wherever life took her, and she would honor the memory of those she had lost by living fully and courageously.
The man walked beside her, quiet but steadfast, a companion in the journey but never a master.
Inspiration. They continued across the plain, toward the mountains and the horizon beyond. Each step was a step into a new life, one where chains no longer defined her, where fear did not control her, and where hope could flourish. She was no longer a captive, no longer a spectacle, no longer defined by the cruelty of others. She was a survivor, a strategist, and a person reclaiming her life one deliberate step at a time. By the end of the journey, the woman had transformed fully from the frightened, chained captive who had been brought into town to a confident, determined individual with agency, dignity, and purpose. Brrr. She had regained her freedom, learned the value of trust, and discovered the power of courage and intelligence. The story of her survival would remain with her, not as a tale of defeat, but as a testament to the strength of the human spirit, the possibility of hope, and the transformative power of compassion and partnership. As she stood on the edge of the mountains looking out over the vast land she had fought to reach, the woman felt a profound sense of peace. She was free. She was alive, and she was ready to build a life on her own terms.
The chains of the past were gone. The fear had lessened, and her spirit soared with the knowledge that she could face whatever the future held.
And for the first time in a long time, she smiled, not out of relief alone, but out of the certainty that she had reclaimed her life, her dignity, and her hope.